So I often hear people being confused about why there are so many different versions of the Bible. Sometimes people even will object to Christianity because of this. And I wanted to briefly talk about why is it that if you walk into a bookstore, you see all these different versions of the Bible, and ESV and NIV. What are all of these things? And to understand that, we need to understand what goes on in the translation process. So the Bible was originally written in three different languages. For the Old Testament, it was primarily Hebrew and Aramaic, and for the New Testament, it was in Greek. So in order to make these works understandable for the English world, they need to be translated into the English language. However, anyone who's ever engaged with interpretation or even just trying to learn a new language knows that if you're trying to go from one language to another, a lot of times it can be very difficult. There are differences in grammar, sentence structure, definite articles, things along those lines, and it can be very difficult. And so when we approach translation, there are different schools of thought or philosophies of how we should go about doing that. And there's kind of a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, we have what's called dynamic equivalence. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have what's called formal equivalence. And these are kind of just fancy words for saying dynamic equivalence is a thought for thought, or the meaning for the meaning. It's just kind of trying to get the basic gist of what's being said and translate that into the new language. On the other side, formal equivalence is trying to get kind of as precisely word for word in the translation as possible. So for instance, if you had the English word or the English phrase, John kicked the bucket. If you were translating that into another language, you would probably just say something like, John died, if you're doing a dynamic equivalence, because that's what that phrase means. Whether if you were going with a formal equivalence or word-for-word translation, you would probably find the new language's word for kicked, the new language's word for bucket, and you would just translate it in that way. It would be more word-for-word. And so when we look at translations of the Bible, the different translations represent this different interpretive philosophies. Some versions of the Bible, like an NIV, lean more towards the thought for thought philosophy of they're just trying to get more of the meaning behind the text, whereas certain other versions like the NSAB or the ESV are leaning more towards presenting something that is closer to the word for word. And it's not that either one of these is strictly better than the other or worse than the other. It's just that they both have strengths and weaknesses, and there are certain places where one is more appropriate than the other.